Hello and welcome. For nearly a century, American presidents largely championed the idea of free trade, viewing tariffs as regrettable taxes and relics of a protectionist past. They relied on global institutions, the WTO, free trade agreements to manage commerce. But when Donald J. Trump returned to the White House, he brought a fundamentally different and profoundly disruptive economic philosophy. For him, a tariff wasn't a necessary evil. It was a weapon of choice, a negotiating bludgeon, and a direct answer to what he saw as decades of global economic manipulation against the United States. His goal: to dismantle the consensus that trade deficits don't matter and force the world to play by his rules. In his first term, we saw the warm-up, targeted steel and aluminum duties, and the initial, fiery volleys against China. But it was in his second term that this weapon was truly unleashed. Through the use of emergency powers, the average tariff rate skyrocketed to levels unseen in 100 years, transforming global commerce into a high-stakes, chaotic battlefield. The world is still trying to decode his strategy. Who were the architects of this vision? Which nations felt the full disruptive force of this economic missile? And what, ultimately, has been the true cost to the American economy and its standing on the world stage? Over the next 8 chapters, we will step inside the high walls of this new tariff war to find out. Chapter 1. Tariffs as a Tool of Power. The story of the tariff war begins with a single, unshakable belief held by one man: that trade deficits are a sign of losing. Most economists view a trade deficit, where a country imports more than it exports, as a simple byproduct of a strong currency and a robust appetite for global goods. Donald Trump, however, views it as evidence of foreign countries systematically raping the U.S. through unfair trade. His solution, which he's championed since the 1980s, is straightforward: hit imports with tariffs until the trade books balance. He sees these tariffs not as a cost, but as a patriotic revenue stream, a way to make foreign countries pay for the privilege of selling to America. This deep conviction became the cornerstone of his second-term policy. The key action was the imposition of a 10% universal, reciprocal tariff on virtually all imports from all countries not already subject to sanctions. This was a fundamental shift. Tariffs were no longer a specialized trade remedy. They were now the central, omnipresent element of American economic policy. This baseline rate was quickly followed by higher, country-specific tariffs for major trading partners like China and Canada. He repeatedly suggested using this massive new revenue to potentially eliminate or replace the income tax, a concept nearly all financial experts have dismissed as mathematically impossible, yet it remained a powerful political talking point. For the president, this wasn't about cautious policy. It was about raw economic power, a weapon finally unlocked and pointed at the global system he saw as fundamentally rigged. Chapter 2. The Tariff Architects. A president may be the general, but he needs his lieutenants. The tariff war was not just a sudden presidential decree. It was the realization of a decades-long philosophy, championed by a handful of fiercely loyal and often highly controversial advisors. In the second term, this group was more cohesive, more powerful, and less constrained by traditional free market voices. The ideological guru of the movement is Peter Navarro, the senior counselor for trade and manufacturing. Navarro's books, which warned of global manipulation, were read by President Trump during his campaigns. Navarro's mantra is simple: tariffs are the necessary price for national security and manufacturing rebirth. He proudly stated his role was to provide the underlying analytics that confirm Trump's intuition, effectively giving the economic rationale for the president's gut feelings. His dismissal of a trade offer from Vietnam, declaring, "This is not a negotiation. This is a national emergency," perfectly captures the hardline, take no prisoners mindset. The execution of the policy falls to key cabinet officials. As Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, a former hedge fund manager known for making billions in global currency bets, brings a financial pragmatism to the chaos. Bessent is the one who defends the tariffs as a strategic tool to generate revenue and protect American industry. Crucially, when the administration faced a major legal challenge to its IEEPA tariffs, it was Bessent who publicly assured the markets that they had fallback legal options, signaling that the tariffs, one way or another, are here to stay. Then there is Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, the former CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald. Lutnick became the policy's most outspoken political defender, framing the duties not just as economic policy but as a form of diplomacy by tax. He made headlines by claiming the president was using tariffs to buy justice, citing the shocking imposition of 50% duties on India in a bid to force it to stop buying Russian oil. This cabinet, working in concert, transformed trade policy from a backroom negotiation into a blunt, nationalistic weapon. Chapter 3: The Tariff Shock and Global Retaliation. The second quarter of 2025 marked the full-scale implementation of the new administration's trade policy, unleashing two distinct, massive waves of tariffs that immediately reshaped global commerce and triggered a volatile cycle of international retaliation. The first wave, fentanyl and borders. The initial salvo was fired on February 1, 2025, when President Trump declared a national emergency regarding illegal migration and fentanyl trafficking. Using the authority granted by the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, he imposed steep tariffs on the U.S. two North American neighbors and its primary economic rival, Canada and Mexico. A 25% tariff was placed on most imports. Due to intense negotiations and the existing North American Free Trade Pact, this was quickly amended. By March 6, goods that qualified for duty-free treatment under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, were exempted. However, a 10% tariff remained on Canadian energy imports. By August, the rate on most non-USMCA goods from Canada increased to 35%. China. A 10% tariff was imposed on all imports from China, including Hong Kong, also citing fentanyl concerns. This rate was then doubled to 20% on March 3, after the administration cited insufficient progress on curbing fentanyl flows. The second wave, the reciprocal tariff and Liberation Day. The more sweeping and globally disruptive measure came on April 2, 2025, which the White House dubbed Liberation Day. The president declared a national emergency over the persistent U.S. goods trade deficit and formally announced the centerpiece of his America First trade agenda, reciprocal tariffs. The 10% universal baseline, effective April 5, 2025. A 10% tariff was imposed on virtually all imported goods from every country that did not already face a higher tariff or exemption. This move, executed under IEEPA authority, dramatically raised the average U.S. tariff rate. Rate increase. The combined effect of the new IEEPA tariffs, fentanyl and reciprocal, and existing levies, like Section 232 on steel and aluminum, propelled the average applied U.S. tariff rate from 2.5% in January to an estimated 18.2% in the spring, a peak not seen since 1941. Escalation, de-escalation, and legal firepower. The immediate aftermath of the tariffs was marked by market turmoil, a trade war with China, and a swift legal challenge. Trade war with China. The March and April U.S. tariff hikes triggered a fierce, short-lived escalation with Beijing. China retaliated with new tariffs on a wide range of U.S. agricultural exports. On April 8 and 9, the U.S. and China exchanged escalating duties, with rates briefly soaring to over 100% on both sides. This crisis was temporarily averted with an agreement on May 12, 2025, which reduced the effective U.S. tariff on Chinese imports to 30% and paused further escalation. The Supreme Court challenge. The use of IEEPA to impose such broad tariffs became an immediate target for legal challenges. On May 28, 2025, the U.S. Court of International Trade ruled that the administration did not have the authority to use emergency powers to combat trade deficits, declaring the IEEPA tariffs unlawful. The administration appealed, and on November 5, 2025, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments on the consolidated case, questioning whether IEEPA's authorization to regulate importation extends to imposing tariffs. As of the end of the year, the tariffs remain in effect while the Supreme Court appeal is pending. De minimis exemption closed. The administration further tightened the border on trade by suspending the de minimis exemption on August 29, 2025, requiring duties to be paid on virtually all low-value imported shipments that had previously entered duty-free. Chapter 4. The Allied Test. When the 10% reciprocal tariff hit the world in April, it landed not just on rivals like China, but on the goods of America's closest friends, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada. This was the true test of President Trump's transactional diplomacy. For decades, the US had offered allies stability. Now, it offered them a choice: negotiate a better deal or pay the tax. The immediate reaction was a blend of shock and swift retaliation. Canada, whose economy is intrinsically linked to the US, was hit hard by the initial 25% fentanyl tariff, which affected goods not covered by the USMCA. New Prime Minister Mark Carney quickly vowed to defend Canadian sovereignty, imposing reciprocal tariffs on billions of dollars of US goods, including products engineered to hurt specific sectors in key US states, a tactic perfected during the first-term trade war. This resulted in a buy-Canadian cultural shift, with consumers shunning US products and Canadian exports pivoting sharply away from the US towards Europe and the UK. Across the Atlantic, the European Union condemned the tariffs as unjust and prepared immediate countermeasures on high-profile American goods like bourbon and jeans. However, the EU's deeper, more strategic response was a decisive move to seek economic independence. EU leaders accelerated new free trade agreements, signaling to the world that they were actively de-risking their supply chains away from an unpredictable United States. But the most fascinating response came from countries that learned how to play Trump to their advantage. Nations like Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam entered quick bilateral talks. While they had to make significant concessions, promising to lower tariffs on US goods and eliminate digital service taxes, they secured crucial exemptions for their most important exports, like generic pharmaceuticals and specific critical minerals. They traded political victories for economic certainty, demonstrating that the only way to win the tariff war was to engage in the president's one-on-one transactional game. The world was forced to adapt, making concessions to avoid the crippling uncertainty of a chaotic trade relationship. Chapter 5. The China Conundrum. While the Allies scrambled to secure exemptions, the US's primary economic rival, China, viewed the new tariff war with a mixture of calculation and open defiance. Having endured a 4-year trade war already, Beijing's response was not one of panic, but of strategic, calibrated pushback. They quickly realized that to deal with the Trump administration, it pays to push back forcefully. When the initial US tariffs hit in February 2025, China's counterpunch was immediate and painful, targeting strategic US sectors. They imposed duties of 10% to 15% on key energy products like LNG and crude oil. But the most politically sensitive target, once again, was U.S. agriculture. New tariffs on a vast array of goods, from soybeans to pork, were designed to inflict maximum pain on farmers in crucial American heartland states, turning economic policy into a domestic political weapon. As the U.S. tariffs soared at one point, hitting over 100% on some Chinese goods, China matched the escalation with its own, briefly pushing commercial relations into a de facto mutual trade embargo. But China's true power lay not in tariffs but in its expanded toolkit of non-tariff measures. They designated multiple U.S. companies to their unreliable entity list, prohibiting trade and new investment. More critically, they activated their ace of spades: new export controls on a range of critical minerals, including rare earth elements, gallium and germanium, materials essential for U.S. high-tech defense systems and semiconductors. Ultimately, the two sides settled into a temporary 180-day truce in May 2025, which saw both sides roll back some of the steepest rates. China agreed to new cooperation on fentanyl and to resume purchasing large volumes of U.S. agricultural products, a symbolic win for the White House. But the Chinese leadership's long-term lesson was clear. The trade war is a structural, long-term feature. Even as they signed truces, Beijing continued to invest heavily in its China Plus One strategy, building regional supply chains and developing alternative financial infrastructure like the SIP system to reduce its reliance on the US dollar, solidifying a strategy of decoupling through defiance. Chapter 6. Impact on the American wallet. The Trump administration sold the tariffs as a tax paid by foreign countries, a geopolitical triumph that would make the U.S. Treasury rich. But in the cold light of economic reality, nearly every major study has reached the same conclusion: tariffs are a tax paid by American consumers and businesses. This truth became visible in two crushing ways. First, inflation. The 10% universal tariff, coupled with the specific duties on high-demand items, caused the U.S. price level to jump sharply. Analysts estimated the resulting price hike represented an average income loss of over $1,800 for the typical American household in the first year alone. Certain categories were hit disproportionately. Prices for imported apparel and footwear, for instance, soared by over 20% initially, while the cost of a new car saw a short-term increase of thousands of dollars. The burden was especially harsh on lower-income families, as they spend a larger share of their income on essential imported goods. Second, the tariffs were a major drag on American businesses and investment. The retaliatory tariffs from countries like China, Canada, and Mexico crippled U.S. agriculture, leading to double-digit drops in exports of staples like soybeans, pork, and dairy. Farmers faced depressed domestic prices and lost market share that may never be recovered. Meanwhile, U.S. manufacturers, far from being protected, saw their input costs rise due to tariffs on imported steel, aluminum, and critical components. This increase in the cost of goods sold led to tighter profit margins and dampened hiring. The overall economic effect was clear. The high tariff wall served to reduce U.S. real GDP growth by an estimated 0.5 percentage point in both 2025 and 2026. While the Treasury collected a massive amount of revenue, over $30 billion per month, this was fundamentally money recycled from the American private sector into the government, slowing overall economic momentum and confirming the fears of Nobel-winning economist Paul Krugman. The tariff war was a self-inflicted headwind. Chapter 7. Reputational damage. The most enduring cost of the tariff war may not be measured in dollars and cents, but in trust, the global trust that forms the foundation of American influence. For decades, the U.S. served as the chief architect and defender of the international economic order. With the new tariffs, that era ended, replaced by an image of America as an unpredictable and unreliable partner. The damage was immediate and self-inflicted, particularly concerning the USMCA, the deal President Trump himself hailed as the largest, most significant, modern, and balanced trade agreement in history when he signed it in his first term. In his second term, he repeatedly used the threat of high tariffs on Canada and Mexico just 5 weeks after the USMCA went into effect to force concessions on non-trade issues like immigration and fentanyl. This move, according to critics, was diplomatic malpractice. By using his own signature accomplishment as a bludgeon, the president signaled that no American promise, no matter how recent or hard-won, was truly safe from the next political demand. His word, even on a deal he championed, was no longer trustworthy. This unpredictability shattered the transatlantic confidence that had been painstakingly rebuilt. Allies in the European Union were targeted with the same broad brush as geopolitical rivals. As one Japanese trade official famously commented, "No matter who I talk to in the U.S. administration, none of them knows what Trump is thinking." This created an environment of low trust, pushing allies to actively de-risk their economies. The EU doubled down on trade agreements with other nations, creating parallel supply chains designed to function without relying on Washington's stability. Ultimately, the aggressive use of tariffs for geopolitical leverage blurred the lines between friend and foe, transforming a powerful nation's economic policy into a global source of anxiety. The result: the U.S. effectively surrendered the global economic leadership mantle, leaving a void that China and other powers are all too eager to fill. Chapter 8. The legal showdown. President Trump's tariff war was not just an economic or diplomatic fight. It was a high-stakes constitutional showdown. His strategy to impose sweeping, universal duties in the name of national emergencies immediately ran into the fundamental legal principle that Congress, not the president, holds the power to tax and set tariffs under Article 1 of the Constitution. The administration's entire legal defense hinged on an obscure sanctions law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. For nearly half a century, IEEPA has been used to freeze assets and prohibit specific transactions against terrorists or rogue states. The Trump administration, however, argued that IEEPA's language allowing the president to regulate importation in an emergency included the power to impose broad, revenue-generating tariffs against nearly every trading partner in the world. This claim was rejected by the lower courts. In May 2025, the U.S. Court of International Trade ruled that the administration lacked the authority to use emergency powers to combat trade deficits and struck down the tariffs. This ruling was largely upheld by the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which explicitly stated that IEEPA did not authorize tariffs of such magnitude, calling into question the legality of tens of billions of dollars already collected. The case was fast-tracked to the Supreme Court, which heard arguments on November 5, 2025. During the hearing, justices across the ideological spectrum expressed deep skepticism, repeatedly questioning why Congress would have silently delegated such massive tax power to the executive branch without using the words tariff or tax. The implications are profound. If the court rules against the administration, the billions collected will be due back to American importers. Yet, the White House is prepared. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has signaled that should IEEPA fall, they will pivot immediately to other, older trade authorities like Section 338, Anti-Discrimination, or Section 232, National Security, to keep the tariffs in place, ensuring the legal uncertainty and the tariff war will persist regardless of the court's final decision. Epilogue. My assessment of Trump's tariff. So, after dissecting the chaos, the war and gurus, the soaring prices, the shattered trust, and the Supreme Court showdown, the question remains, was the Trump tariff war a failure of policy or a success of strategy? For conventional economics and the rules-based global system, the verdict is clear. The policy was a failure. Tariffs acted as a massive regressive tax on the American consumer, dampened U.S. growth, and utterly failed to resolve the core trade deficits they were intended to fix. Furthermore, the willingness to tear up agreements like the USMCA cemented a reputation for unpredictability that will haunt American diplomats for a decade. But for President Trump and his supporters, the measure of success is different. His method, the constant uncertainty, the aggressive use of IEEPA, and the indiscriminate targeting of everyone, was designed to break the system. And in that, he succeeded. He irrevocably weaponized global trade, forcing the world to acknowledge that economic interdependence is now fully subservient to geopolitical power. The long-term challenge is not what President Trump won, but what he destroyed. He forced the world to adapt to a reality defined by strategic capitalism and decoupling, leaving behind a multilateral order in shambles. The tariff war has ended a decades-long consensus on free trade. The long-term task now facing the United States is figuring out how to lead in this newly competitive, lower trust, and decidedly more dangerous world he helped create. Now, what do you think of Trump's tariff war? Share your comments down below. Whether you agree with him, whether you don't, whether you agree with me, whether you don't, I'd like to hear from you. This has been Rufus Brown, and I'll see you for the next intellectual deep dive.